In a city brimming with exclusivity, James Franklin stood guard at the entrance of his beloved restaurant, Maison de Luxe. At 62, James embodied sophistication, a man of precise tastes and exacting standards. The restaurant was not just a dining venue, it was a monument to his success, nestled in the city's most affluent neighborhood, and celebrated for its high-end French cuisine and distinguished service. Maison de Luxe had built a reputation for offering an unmatched, refined experience, attracting the city's most influential residents, lawyers, politicians, entertainers, and CEOs, all enticed by the privacy and prestige James had crafted over years of meticulous work. As he scanned the evening crowd with a practiced eye, he felt immense pride in the ambiance he had created. Every detail had been curated to perfection. The pure white table linens, the delicate arrangements of fresh flowers, the soft glow from opulent chandeliers casting a warm, inviting light, and the faint strains of classical music creating an atmosphere of sophistication. This wasn't just any restaurant, it was a refuge for the elite, a place James regarded as the very pinnacle of refined taste. To him, maintaining this image was paramount. He saw himself as the gatekeeper of his establishment's prestige. Dressed impeccably himself, with silver hair neatly styled and a custom-fitted suit, James exuded authority. His face was marked with sharp lines, and he carried himself with an air of control, every movement deliberate, his gaze keen. Those around him admired his polished exterior and enviable achievements, but few saw the beliefs that lurked beneath his refined demeanor. James held a silent conviction about who deserved to dine in his establishment and who did not. While never overtly prejudiced, he was known for his subtle ways of discerning who belonged and who didn't fit the image he had so carefully crafted. To James, Maison de Luxe was meant for those who met his unspoken criteria, and he quietly discouraged those he deemed unsuitable from returning. As James watched over the evening's patrons, his gaze fell upon a couple approaching the entrance. The man was tall and wore a finely tailored black suit, his bearing calm and self-assured. The woman beside him was stunning in a flowing red dress that complemented her grace and elegance. Their clothing was exquisite, chosen thoughtfully, and their demeanor dignified. Yet, as they neared, James's expression tightened slightly. He recognized that the couple, Aaron and Mia Clark, were black. James's polished smile faltered just for a moment, enough for those who knew him well to recognize his discomfort. In his mind, Maison de Luxe was meant to serve a particular kind of clientele, and he couldn't reconcile the couple's presence with his own rigid views of who should grace the restaurant's tables. Though the Clarks' appearance radiated elegance and sophistication, James could only see what he had trained himself to notice first: a discrepancy between his vision of exclusivity and their presence in his restaurant. Aaron Clark was a confident man, tall and well-dressed, with an air of quiet strength in his posture. His wife, Mia, mirrored his confidence, her dark curls framing a face filled with warmth and intelligence. They carried themselves with a kind of self-assurance that, for some reason, unnerved James. As they approached, James took a deep breath, steeling himself to extend his usual polished welcome. "Good evening," he said, his tone smooth yet guarded. "Do you have a reservation tonight?" "Yes, it's under Clark," Aaron replied with a warm smile. James nodded, though he still couldn't shake his discomfort. He couldn't help but wonder how they had made the reservation. In his mind, Aaron and Mia's presence contradicted the restaurant's image. Reluctantly, he gestured for his maitre d' to confirm the booking, and the maître d' gave a slight nod, signaling that the reservation was indeed valid. "Right this way, Mr. Clark," James said, his voice as courteous as ever. He led the couple through the restaurant, glancing at a few regular patrons who exchanged subtle looks that reflected his own unease. While the evening continued smoothly, Aaron and Mia Clark's arrival had unsettled James in a way he couldn't fully explain. As he seated them at a table tucked discreetly near the kitchen, far from the center of the dining area, James felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. This was a table he often reserved for guests he deemed less desirable, a quiet reminder to them of their perceived status. Smiling politely, he bade the couple a pleasant evening, though the placement of their table held a silent message. The Clarks exchanged a look, but refrained from commenting. They took their seats with poise, choosing to focus on each other and the evening they had come to enjoy, rather than letting James's subtle message taint their celebration. Aaron pulled out a chair for Mia, and they sat together, exuding the grace and dignity that had likely irked James in the first place. As James walked back toward the entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling that the couple's calmness and confidence defied his expectations, challenging the carefully constructed boundaries of his restaurant's exclusivity. As James returned to his station, he whispered to his maître d', "Keep an eye on them, and make sure everything is handled appropriately." The maître nodded, understanding the underlying message. Throughout the evening, James stole glances at Aaron and Mia, looking for any sign that would validate his discomfort. But the Clarks continued to enjoy their evening with a quiet composure that frustrated him further. Inside, James felt the stirrings of unease. He had built this restaurant as a haven for those he deemed worthy, and now, for the first time, he was questioning what that distinction truly meant. Jackson Reed's practiced smile faltered as he spotted the couple approaching Maison de Lumière. It was a small, nearly imperceptible reaction, but to those who knew him, it was a telltale sign of his disapproval. Malcolm Carter was tall and broad-shouldered, exuding calm confidence with each step. His skin, a rich espresso, and his neatly cropped hair gave him a dignified presence. Beside him, his wife Lillian walked with graceful poise, her dark curls framing her face as her warm eyes sparkled with intelligence and elegance. Together, they made a striking couple, radiating a sophistication that drew admiration from many, but not from Jackson. Jackson's carefully maintained view of his restaurant immediately overshadowed any appreciation for Malcolm and Lillian's refinement. Maison de Lumière had been his creation, and he had meticulously curated it to appeal to a certain clientele, fostering an atmosphere he believed represented exclusivity. He questioned whether they truly belonged in his establishment, wondering if their presence might somehow disrupt the image he had crafted. As the Carters reached the entrance, Jackson managed to muster a courteous smile, greeting them with his customary polished tone. "Good evening," he said, keeping his voice smooth and composed. "Do you have a reservation this evening?" "Yes, we do," Malcolm replied with a warm smile, "under the name Carter." Jackson's eyes flickered subtly, though he nodded in acknowledgement. Internally, he was already making silent judgments. Was there a mistake in his reservation system? How had they been able to reserve a spot here without his notice? He turned slightly to his maître, who stood a few steps back and gave a barely visible nod. The maître d' quickly reviewed the reservation list, then returned Jackson's glance with a nod of confirmation. "Ah, Mr. Carter," Jackson said smoothly, keeping his tone professional. "Right this way, please." As he led the Carters through the dining area, Jackson couldn't help but notice the subtle looks exchanged by his other patrons. The usual clientele, affluent, predominantly white, were accustomed to a certain atmosphere here. Jackson caught a few raised eyebrows and knowing glances shared among diners. He knew what they were thinking, because he was thinking it too. What are they doing here? The couple's very presence seemed to unsettle the carefully upheld image of exclusivity Jackson had worked so hard to cultivate. Guiding them through the main dining room, Jackson led the Carters to a table near the back, strategically placed closer to the kitchen doors and away from the dining room's prime area. It was a spot he reserved for those he deemed out of place for the upscale atmosphere he was so determined to protect. The table's position, tucked discreetly into a less central corner, was Jackson's silent but deliberate way of sending a message. "Here we are," Jackson announced, gesturing to the table with his most polished smile. "I hope you enjoy your evening with us." Malcolm and Lillian exchanged a quick, knowing glance, but said nothing. With Malcolm pulling out a chair for Lillian before sitting himself, the couple took their seats in quiet elegance. Jackson lingered a moment longer, observing them with a critical eye. He noted their calm composure, the effortless way they held themselves with dignity and grace. However, instead of seeing their elegance, Jackson only saw what he had already decided upon: two people who, in his mind, simply did not belong. Satisfied that his message had been subtly delivered, Jackson returned to his station at the front of the restaurant, casting a brief look back at the Carters. "Thank you," Lillian said, her voice soft but firm. We're looking forward to it." Jackson Reed gave a curt nod and turned away, though his thoughts remained fixed on the Carters. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling their presence had stirred within him. It wasn't simply that they were black. It was the way they carried themselves, with an undeniable confidence, as though they belonged there as much as anyone else. Jackson was accustomed to his restaurant's exclusivity, intimidating newcomers, reminding them of the elite standard he maintained. But Malcolm and Lillian didn't seem fazed in the slightest. Their ease and self-assurance unsettled him, challenging the preconceptions he held. Back at the entrance, Jackson pulled his Mattard aside and whispered, "Keep an eye on them. Make sure everything is handled appropriately." The Mattard nodded with a brief, knowing look. "Of course, Mr. Reed." With his instructions delivered, Jackson resumed his post, yet his thoughts lingered on the Carters. Their unruffled demeanor pricked at his own insecurities, and the feeling only intensified his determination to maintain control over the evening's flow. He kept glancing in their direction, almost as though he expected to find some misstep that would validate his unease. But Malcolm and Lillian remained poised and unfazed, quietly perusing their menus and engaging in quiet conversation, seemingly unaware of the scrutiny cast upon them. For the Carters, this night was a deeply meaningful one. It marked their 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone they had looked forward to celebrating for months. They had chosen Maison de Lumière not only because of its prestigious reputation, but also as a reward for the hard work and dedication they'd poured into their careers and life together. They had seen the restaurant's allure described in luxury magazines and felt that they deserved a night of elegance, a chance to relax, to celebrate without any distractions from their usual routine. However, the moment they entered the restaurant, both Malcolm and Lillian sensed the tension in the air. They had noticed how Jackson's welcoming smile hadn't quite reached his eyes, how he had led them to a table that seemed purposefully set apart from the main, bustling heart of the dining room. They weren't strangers to this sort of subtle dismissal. Over the years, they'd experienced similar treatment in other refined spaces where they were expected to remain invisible, despite their elegance and accomplishments. But tonight, they had hoped things would be different. Tonight, they wanted to celebrate freely, without the quiet complexities that sometimes accompanied their presence in spaces like this. Seated at their tucked-away table, Lillian reached across to take Malcolm's hand, her fingers warm against his. She looked around the room, her eyes admiring the tasteful decor, the glittering chandeliers, the delicate arrangements. "It's a beautiful restaurant," she said quietly, her voice filled with appreciation. Malcolm nodded, though he sensed the unspoken words between them. "It is," he agreed, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Let's make the most of it." Both knew what was happening, the invisible boundary they had crossed by being here, but they refused to let it ruin their evening. They'd spent years learning how to navigate subtle dismissals and microaggressions that followed them in spaces like this, and they had long since decided to rise above it all. They weren't about to let someone else's narrow views overshadow their joy. For Malcolm and Lillian, this evening was theirs to savor, a rare moment set aside for each other, away from the pressures of daily life. Determined not to let any negativity interfere, they settled into their seats, exchanging quiet smiles, reminding each other why they had come. While Jackson's carefully guarded gaze lingered on them from afar, they remained unaffected, intent on enjoying every moment of the night meant to celebrate their love. Tonight was supposed to be all about Malcolm and Lillian Carter, a night to celebrate their love and the life they had built together. They weren't going to let Jackson Reed's narrow-mindedness spoil it. As the evening progressed, however, Jackson's disapproval grew increasingly noticeable. He found himself casting frequent glances at the Carters, almost as if he expected them to do something that would validate his biases. But they did nothing out of place. Malcolm and Lillian were the picture of grace and refinement, treating the staff with respect and conducting themselves with an impeccable sense of decorum. Their presence alone seemed to challenge Jackson's beliefs about who belonged in his restaurant. Malcolm and Lillian, although composed, were keenly aware of the subtle hostility directed their way. They noticed how the waitstaff seemed hesitant to approach their table, the way other diners glanced at them before quickly looking away, as if judging their every move. They were accustomed to these silent judgments, though, and had long since decided never to let such treatment make them uncomfortable. In response to the scrutiny, they remained calm, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them unsettled. Meanwhile, Jackson wrestled with his own inner conflict. On one hand, he took pride in his veneer of professionalism and the polite mask he wore, never openly displaying his prejudices. But on the other hand, he couldn't ignore the way Malcolm and Lillian's presence in his restaurant unsettled him. Their confidence and elegance quietly defied the invisible boundaries he had built around Maison de Lumière. He resented them for challenging the atmosphere he had so carefully cultivated, a place he believed meant only for those of his class and expectations. The evening at Maison de Lumière was in full swing. Conversations flowed softly across tables as patrons sipped fine wines and enjoyed exquisitely plated dishes. The gentle clink of silverware against porcelain and the quiet murmur of voices filled the air with an ambience of refined tranquility. For Jackson, everything was just as it should be. Everything except the presence of the Carters. Seated at their table for some time now, the Carters were patiently waiting for their first course to arrive. They had done everything right, reserved well in advance, arrived promptly, and showed nothing but the utmost politeness to everyone around them. And yet, Jackson's irritation simmered just beneath the surface. He couldn't escape the notion that they somehow didn't belong, that their mere presence upset the carefully curated image he held for his establishment. Jackson decided it was time to reassert control, to subtly remind them that this was, after all, his restaurant. His first move was discreet but calculated. He instructed the waitstaff to delay the Carters' food, ensuring that while other tables were promptly served, Malcolm and Lillian's appetizers would arrive noticeably late. When the couple's first course didn't appear as expected, Malcolm and Lillian exchanged a glance, fully aware of the delay. But they chose to remain unruffled, instead sipping their water and engaging in quiet conversation. Despite the slight, they kept their heads high, choosing to enjoy each other's company rather than dwell on the insult. They had been in similar situations before and knew that such behavior was often an attempt to unnerve them, to remind them of the unspoken rules others expected them to abide by. But they refused to let Jackson or anyone else define their evening. Their patience and grace spoke volumes, and even as they waited, they remained a poised presence amidst a room that seemed to judge them merely for existing there. Jackson, however, could not let go of his irritation. In his mind, this was a place for those who appreciated his particular brand of exclusivity. And yet, despite his attempts to subtly undermine their experience, Malcolm and Lillian remained composed, their calm demeanor a silent rebuke to his every action. Malcolm and Lillian continued to savor their evening, refusing to let the delayed service spoil their mood. But as the minutes ticked by, Jackson Reed's frustration grew. He had hoped the wait would make the Carters feel uncomfortable, perhaps even provoke them into complaining, but they remained calm, untouched by the slight. Their poise only irritated Jackson further, as if they were mocking him by calmly defying the unspoken rules he believed defined his restaurant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a waiter approached their table with the appetizers. The young man's hands trembled slightly as he set down the plates, clearly uneasy about the tension in the air. Jackson had made it known to his staff that the Carters were not to receive the same level of service as other patrons, and the waiter had followed his instructions to the letter. "Sorry for the delay," the waiter mumbled, avoiding eye contact as he placed the dishes on the table. "No problem," Malcolm replied with a polite smile. "Thank you." The waiter nodded quickly and hurried off, relieved to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere. As Malcolm and Lillian began to eat, Jackson watched them intently from across the room, his thoughts racing. Their composure seemed unshakable, and it only fueled his irritation further. He needed to find a way to make it clear they weren't welcome here, something more direct to reinforce his authority. Leaning in close to his maître d', Jackson whispered, "Check their reservation again. Make sure it's legitimate." The maître d' hesitated for a brief moment, sensing the underlying hostility in Jackson's request. but he knew better than to question his boss. "Of course, Mr. Reed," he replied, bowing slightly before hurrying away to carry out the order. After a few minutes, the Matterdeads returned with the confirmation that the Carters' reservation was, in fact, legitimate. Jackson felt a surge of anger. He had been hoping for any excuse to confront the couple directly, but with their reservation confirmed, he couldn't simply dismiss them without risking a scene. Determined not to let the matter drop, Jackson decided to take things into his own hands. He straightened his suit jacket, put on his most practiced smile, and made his way to their table. Malcolm and Lillian looked up as he approached, their expressions polite but guarded. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter," Jackson began, his tone smooth but with a trace of condescension. "I trust you're enjoying your evening so far?" "We are, thank you," Lillian replied, her voice calm and measured. "Good, good," Jackson said, nodding slowly. "I wanted to personally ensure that everything was to your satisfaction. You see, we pride ourselves on providing an exceptional dining experience here at Maison de Lumière, and I would hate for anything to be out of place." There was a subtle edge to Jackson's words, a hint that suggested the Carters themselves were out of place. Malcolm and Lillian understood the implication immediately, but they refused to take the bait. "Everything has been fine," Malcolm responded, his voice steady. "We appreciate your concern." Jackson's smile tightened. He could sense that they weren't going to be intimidated, but he wasn't ready to back down. "I couldn't help but notice," Jackson continued, his tone now sharp with an unmistakable edge, "that your reservation caused a bit of confusion earlier. It's rare that we encounter such unusual circumstances." Lillian raised an eyebrow, her expression calm yet questioning. "Unusual circumstances?" Jackson nodded, his practiced smile never faltering. "Yes, well, we don't often receive reservations from—" He paused, carefully choosing his words, "guests who are new to our establishment." Malcolm and Lillian exchanged a quick, understanding glance. They knew exactly what Jackson was implying, but were not about to give him the satisfaction of reacting. Malcolm met Jackson's gaze, maintaining the composed politeness he'd shown all evening. "We made the reservation through the usual process," Malcolm replied smoothly. "I'm sure it was no different from any other reservation you've received." Jackson's irritation flared. Their unwavering composure only made him more determined to break it. He had hoped they might be rattled, perhaps even offended enough to respond defensively, giving him a reason to reassert his authority more openly. But instead, they continued to answer calmly, refusing to give in to his thinly veiled provocations. Of course," Jackson replied, though his voice tightened. "I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. As you understand, we maintain certain standards here." "We understand," Lillian replied, her tone cool but polite. "And we appreciate your attention to detail. It's part of the reason we chose to celebrate our anniversary here." Jackson's practiced smile faltered for a split second, taken aback by the mention of their anniversary. For a brief moment he considered letting the matter go, sensing the significance of their celebration. But his pride would not allow him to back down. He had already convinced himself that the Carters didn't belong, and he wasn't about to let them enjoy their evening without subtly reminding them of that fact. "Well," Jackson said, straightening his posture slightly, "I'm glad to hear that. But I must admit, I'm surprised you chose Maison de Lumière for such a special occasion. It's not typically a place one finds your type of clientele." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. For the first time, Jackson had come close to openly stating what he had only hinted at up to now. He watched their faces carefully, hoping to see a flicker of discomfort, a crack in their poise. But Malcolm and Lillian didn't flinch. Instead, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. He repeated Jackson's phrase, his voice steady. "Our type of clientele?" He paused, allowing the question to sink in. "And what type would that be, Mr. Reed?" For a moment, Jackson hesitated, sensing he had walked into a trap, but he was too far gone to backpedal now. He felt compelled to regain control of the conversation, no matter the cost to his image. "We cater to a very specific demographic," Jackson said, picking his words with deliberate caution. "Our guests expect a particular atmosphere, a level of exclusivity, if you will. I'm not sure you quite understand the nature of our establishment." There it was, the thinly veiled insult Jackson had been trying to suppress, but could no longer hold back. He had finally vocalized the sentiment he'd been harboring since the moment the Carters walked in, implying in the clearest terms that he believed they didn't belong. In Jackson's eyes, Malcolm and Lillian didn't belong here, and he wanted them to know it. A heavy silence settled over the table as Malcolm and Lillian exchanged a meaningful glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Without breaking eye contact with Jackson, Malcolm finally spoke. "I see," Malcolm said quietly. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Reed." There was something in Malcolm's tone, a calm acceptance, that unsettled Jackson, though he couldn't quite understand why. He had expected anger, maybe even outrage, but instead, Malcolm's response was composed, almost as if he had anticipated this moment and had been prepared for it. Lillian leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady and unflinching. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice firm yet polite. "But I assure you, we are fully aware of the nature of this establishment. That's exactly why we chose to dine here tonight. We were looking forward to a special evening together." For a brief moment, Jackson felt a flicker of doubt. There was something about their unwavering confidence that gnawed at him, but he quickly pushed the feeling aside. He reminded himself that he was the owner of Maison de Lumière, and that he had the final say on who was welcome in his restaurant. "I'm afraid I must insist," Jackson said, his voice growing colder. "I don't believe this is the right place for you. It would be best if you left." The words were out before Jackson could stop himself, crossing a line he hadn't intended to cross. He felt the weight of what he'd said, but was too entrenched in his own pride to take it back. He had made his position clear, and now there was no turning back. Malcolm and Lillian sat in silence, letting Jackson's words sink in. Then, with quiet dignity, Malcolm rose from his seat and Lillian followed suit, her expression calm but resolute. They both knew they could escalate the situation, but they also understood that this wasn't the time or place for a confrontation. Despite the blatant disrespect they had just endured, they refused to let Jackson see them as anything other than dignified. As they gathered their belongings, Jackson felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. A hint of doubt, maybe even regret. But he quickly buried it, reassuring himself that he had done what was necessary to protect the image of his restaurant, to keep it as a place for the right kind of people. Just as they were about to leave, Malcolm turned back to face Jackson. There was a calm intensity in his eyes, a quiet strength that made Jackson suddenly feel very small. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Reed," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "We won't trouble you further, but remember this, people will always show you who they really are, one way or another." Lillian nodded in agreement, her gaze unwavering. "Have a good evening," she added, her voice polite but firm. With that, Malcolm and Lillian turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Jackson standing there, his hands clenched at his sides. The other diners, who had been watching the exchange with varying degrees of interest, quickly returned to their meals, pretending not to have noticed. But the tension in the room lingered, a subtle unease that hung heavy in the air long after the Carters had gone. The lingering unease settled over Maison de Lumière long after Malcolm and Lillian Carter had gone. Jackson Reed returned to his post, his expression outwardly composed, yet inside, he couldn't shake the nagging sense that he'd made a grave mistake. A faint voice in the back of his mind whispered that there would be consequences for what he had done, that his actions tonight would come back to haunt him. But Jackson pushed that thought away. Burying it alongside the discomfort that nagged at him, he told himself he had won, that he had asserted his authority and protected the integrity of his establishment. That was all that mattered, or so he insisted to himself. Deep down, however, in a place he rarely allowed himself to explore, Jackson knew that this wasn't over. He had set something in motion, something beyond his control. Though he couldn't fully grasp it yet, the events of the evening would come to change his life in ways he could never have anticipated. As Malcolm and Lillian walked away from Maison Lumière, they exchanged a look, one filled with understanding. There was no need for words. Each knew what the other was thinking. They had been humiliated, yes, but in Jackson they had also seen something unintentional. His weakness, his insecurity, his fear. and they knew that ultimately it would be Jackson who would pay the price for his actions. They had the resources, the connections, and most importantly, the resolve to turn this night of humiliation into something much more powerful. But for now, they walked away in silence, leaving that chapter behind as they stepped forward into a future that would look very different for them and for Jackson. The following days passed quietly at Maison de Lumière, and Jackson had almost put the unpleasant evening out of his mind. He had convinced himself that he'd handled the situation as he should have, preserving the exclusivity of his restaurant. To Jackson, the Carters had been nothing more than an unfortunate blip, a minor disruption in the perfectly curated image he'd cultivated for his establishment. He fully expected his life and business to continue as they always had, undisturbed by the events of that night. But as often happens, life has a way of turning the tables when one least expects it. It was an unusually quiet morning at the restaurant. The dining room, normally filled with the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of fine china, was empty. Jackson was in his office, focused on his weekly reports, his mind occupied with the minute details of running his business. He prided himself on running Maison de Lumière like a well-oiled machine, overseeing every aspect to ensure that no detail was left to chance. As he sifted through the paperwork on his desk, there was a soft knock at the door. His assistant, a young man named Patrick, stepped in, holding a sleek, elegant envelope. Typically composed, Patrick seemed to have a curious look on his face that caught Jackson's attention. "Mr. Reed," Patrick said, extending the envelope, "this came for you this morning. It's marked urgent." Jackson took the envelope, his brow furrowing slightly as he examined it. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, and embossed with a subtle, sophisticated pattern that suggested wealth and prestige. The return address on the envelope was from a prestigious law firm, one Jackson recognized immediately, a firm known for representing high-profile clients and handling significant financial transactions. "Thank you, Patrick," Jackson said, dismissing his assistant with a wave. Once alone, he carefully opened the envelope, curiosity piqued by what could require such urgency. Inside was a letter printed on fine stationery, embossed with the law firm's logo. The letter's tone was formal, to the point, and written on behalf of an unnamed client. "Dear Mr. Reed, we are reaching out on behalf of a client who has expressed significant interest in acquiring your restaurant. Our client, a prominent investor with an extensive portfolio in the hospitality industry, is prepared to make an offer we believe will be more than satisfactory. Due to the sensitive nature of this transaction, our client requests a private meeting to discuss the terms and conditions of the acquisition. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange a time that suits your schedule. We look forward to your prompt response. Sincerely, Andrew R. Lawson Esker, Lawson & Hale Associates." Jackson read the letter twice, a slow smile spreading across his face. The idea of selling Maison de Lumière at a high valuation was indeed appealing, even if he hadn't planned on it this soon. The prospect of cashing out at the restaurant's peak was an idea he'd considered in passing, an enticing notion of going out on top, taking his legacy and wealth to new heights. The reputation of the law firm suggested the offer was serious, potentially even extraordinary. One detail, however, piqued his curiosity: the identity of the investor. The letter kept the client's identity anonymous, likely as a tactic to maintain privacy during initial negotiations, but Jackson's curiosity grew. Was it a competing restaurateur looking to expand? Or perhaps an affluent entrepreneur aiming to break into the fine dining world? The possibilities intrigued him. Deciding that this was an opportunity worth exploring, Jackson contacted the law firm immediately and scheduled a meeting for the following day. As he hung up the phone, he felt a surge of anticipation. If the offer was as promising as the letter suggested, this could be the deal of a lifetime. The next morning, Jackson arrived at Lawson & Hale Associates, a sleek, modern building in the city's financial district. The lobby was outfitted with glass walls and polished stone floors, a reflection of the firm's wealth and influence. Jackson was greeted by a sharply dressed receptionist who escorted him to a conference room on the top floor. The conference room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. A large, polished mahogany table filled the center of the room, flanked by plush leather chairs. True to his style, Jackson was early, giving himself time to take in the luxurious surroundings. He had always considered himself a man of refined taste, someone who understood and appreciated life's finer things. This room, with its understated elegance, was exactly the kind of place where multi-million-dollar deals were made, where power and influence were wielded without a word. As he waited, Jackson let his thoughts wander to what his life might look like after such a deal. As Jackson Reed waited in the luxurious conference room, his mind wandered, envisioning what life might be like after the sale. He could travel more, perhaps buy a villa in the south of France or a penthouse in New York. He could diversify his investments, expand his portfolio, or even start a new venture if he wanted. The possibilities felt endless, and the taste of such freedom was intoxicating. The door to the conference room swung open, and Jackson turned, expecting to see a senior partner from the law firm or perhaps the mysterious investor himself. Instead, the sight that greeted him left him frozen in shock. Standing confidently in the doorway, impeccably dressed in tailored business attire, were none other than Malcolm and Lillian Carter. For a moment, Jackson's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He had expected a high-profile investor, someone from his own world, someone who fit his image of a powerful dealmaker. The last people he could have imagined were the same couple he had dismissed and thrown out of his restaurant just days before. Yet there they were, calm, composed, and exuding an undeniable air of quiet authority. "Mr. Reed," Malcolm said smoothly, his voice steady and professional. "Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time." Jackson blinked, his usual composure slipping. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, this is unexpected." Lillian stepped forward, her expression polite yet firm. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Reed. We have a lot to discuss." Still reeling from the shock, Jackson found himself moving on autopilot, taking a seat at the table across from the Carters. Malcolm and Lillian settled in opposite him, and as they did, a team of lawyers and financial advisors entered, carrying briefcases and thick folders. The advisors took their places on either side of the Carters, underscoring the couple's authority in the room. For a moment, there was silence as everyone settled in and began arranging their documents. Jackson's mind raced, scrambling to make sense of what was happening. How could this be? How could these people, the ones he had dismissed as insignificant, now be seated across from him, preparing to negotiate a deal worth millions? Finally, Malcolm broke the silence. "Mr. Reed, I'm sure you're wondering why we're here today," he began, leaning forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Allow me to explain." Jackson swallowed, barely managing a nod, his attention fully riveted on Malcolm's words. "My wife and I are entrepreneurs," Malcolm continued calmly. "We've built a significant portfolio in the hospitality industry, including several high-end restaurants. When we visited Maison de Lumière the other night, it wasn't just for our anniversary. We were also there to evaluate your establishment as a potential acquisition." Jackson felt the floor drop out from under him. He had thought he was dealing with just another couple who didn't belong, but in reality, they had been assessing him and his business. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he struggled to maintain his composure. Malcolm continued, his voice calm and controlled. "After our experience at your restaurant, we took some time to review our options. We've decided that Maison de Lumière and your other establishments would make a valuable addition to our portfolio. That's why we're here today, Mr. Reed," Malcolm said, his tone measured. "We're here to make you an offer." Jackson blinked, struggling to find his voice. "An offer?" "Yes," Lillian replied, her tone businesslike and direct. "We're prepared to purchase your entire restaurant chain for a price well above market value. We believe this transaction will benefit both parties." Jackson stared, his mind spinning. Why would they want his restaurants after the way he had treated them? And why were they offering above market value? It didn't add up. There had to be a catch. Sensing Jackson's confusion, Malcolm leaned in, clarifying with calm precision. "We're offering you a generous price because we believe in the potential of these establishments. However, there are conditions that must be met for the deal to go through." "Conditions?" Jackson echoed, his voice taut. "Yes," Malcolm replied, leaning back in his chair. First, the sale must be completed immediately. We don't want this process to drag on for months. We have the resources to finalize the transaction quickly, and we expect the same commitment from you. Jackson nodded slowly. The condition was unusual but not unheard of in high-stakes deals, especially if the buyer was intent on rapid expansion. He could see the logic in wanting to move quickly. And, he prompted, struggling to keep his tone neutral. The second condition, Lillian said, her gaze steady, is that once the sale is complete, you leave quietly. There will be no public statements, no interviews, no lingering involvement. You will take your profit and move on. Jackson's eyes narrowed, bristling at this term. He had poured years into building these restaurants from scratch, investing his time, passion, and reputation into their success. The idea of stepping away without a word, without any acknowledgement of his role, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked to create. And finally, Malcolm continued, his voice taking on a firmer edge, you will agree never to open a similar establishment again. You will not compete with us in any way, shape, or form. If you do, we will consider it a breach of contract and pursue legal action. Jackson's composure cracked. He had anticipated a straightforward business transaction, not what now felt like a hostile takeover. These conditions seemed designed not just to buy his business, but to strip him of his identity, to erase his legacy. He felt a surge of anger but forced himself to remain calm, to think rationally through the mounting frustration. Why these conditions? He asked, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion. Why do you want me out so completely? Malcolm and Lillian exchanged a glance before Malcolm replied, his tone steady and resolute. Let's just say we believe in doing business with integrity, Mr. Reed. The way you treated us the other night showed us exactly who you are, and we have no interest in being associated with that kind of attitude. We're offering you a way out. A very profitable way out, but it comes with the understanding that you will step aside completely. Jackson felt a flash of indignation as Malcolm's words sank in. Indignation flared in Jackson Reed's chest. How dare they judge him? They didn't know him, didn't understand the immense pressures he faced or the image he had to maintain. But as he looked at Malcolm and Lillian, the calm resolve in their expressions told him there was no point in arguing. They held all the power now, and they knew it. Still, Jackson couldn't resist pushing back. And if I refuse? He asked, his voice strained. Lillian's expression remained steady, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. If you refuse, she said, we'll walk away from this deal and we'll make sure everyone knows why. Your investors, your clients, the media, they'll all hear about how you treated us. And trust me, Mr. Reed, in today's world, a story like that spreads fast. Jackson's stomach twisted. He knew she was right. A scandal of that nature could destroy everything he had built. His reputation, his business, his future. It would all be in jeopardy. The realization was bitter, and it stung even more because he knew there was no escaping it. He was cornered by his own actions, and the same couple he dismissed as insignificant now had the power to strip him of everything. For a long, silent moment, Jackson sat with his mind racing, desperately considering his options. He could try to negotiate, but he knew it would be futile. Malcolm and Lillian had come prepared. They wouldn't back down. They were offering him a way out, and as much as it pained him to admit it, he realized he had no choice but to accept. With great reluctance, Jackson nodded. Fine, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll agree to your terms. A small, satisfied smile appeared on Malcolm's face. Excellent. Our lawyers will finalize the paperwork and we can proceed with the sale. Lillian nodded, her expression softening slightly. You're making the right decision, Mr. Reed. This will be good for everyone involved. Jackson didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak, afraid that his anger and bitterness might seep into his words. Instead, he simply nodded again, a silent gesture of surrender. The meeting continued, with the lawyers outlining the details of the contract and the process for the sale. Jackson sat through it in a daze, still reeling from the shock of the situation. It felt surreal, as though he were watching someone else's life unravel before him. But it was all too real, and there was no way out. By the time the meeting ended, the deal was all but sealed. The final papers would be signed within the week, and then it would be over. Jackson would walk away with a substantial sum of money, but it would come at the cost of everything he had worked for, everything that had defined him. As Malcolm and Lillian stood to leave, Malcolm extended his hand to Jackson. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Reed. We'll make sure the transition is smooth." Jackson shook his hand, his grip stiff and formal. "I'm sure you will," he replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. Lillian gave him a polite nod. "Goodbye, Mr. Reed. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." With that, they turned and left, leaving Jackson standing alone in the elegant conference room, feeling as though the ground had fallen out from beneath him. The Carters and their legal team left the room, walking out with confident strides, leaving Jackson Reed seated alone, staring blankly at the table in front of him. His mind was a churning storm of emotions, anger, resentment, regret, all swirling uncontrollably. But underneath these feelings was something darker, something that unnerved him. For the first time in his life, Jackson felt true fear. Jackson had always prided himself on being in control, on steering his own destiny. Now, however, he realized that his own choices had cornered him. The decisions he'd made, the beliefs he had clung to, had led him straight to this moment, and he had no one to blame but himself. As he sat in the empty conference room, the reality of his actions weighed on him heavily. His life would never be the same. It wasn't just his business he had lost, it was his pride, his dignity, and even his sense of self. He was unmoored, cast adrift in a world that suddenly felt foreign and unkind. There was no undoing what had been done, no way to turn back time. The unexpected twist that had brought Malcolm and Lillian Carter into his life had unraveled everything he thought he knew, leaving him facing an uncertain future he felt powerless to navigate. For the first time, Jackson felt the weight of his own insignificance pressing down on him. He had always believed that his wealth and status made him untouchable, that he was somehow above the people he had dismissed so easily. But he now understood the bitter truth. In the end, it wasn't money or influence that defined a person, but their choices and how they treated others. And Jackson knew that his choices had brought him here, into a moment of defeat, of surrender, and of painful realization. As he left the law firm and stepped out into the bustling city streets, Jackson felt the biting cold of the wind against his face. He pulled his coat tightly around him, but the chill settled deeper, reaching a place within that warmth couldn't touch. The city moved on around him, indifferent to his silent turmoil. He headed back to the restaurant, which, for a short time longer, was still his. But as he walked, he knew the world he had once felt in command of was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The crisp autumn air seemed colder than usual as Jackson returned to Maison de Lumière after the meeting, his mind in turmoil, wrestling with conflicting thoughts and emotions. He had always taken pride in being decisive, in knowing what he wanted and how to achieve it. But now, for the first time, he felt completely lost. The Carters' offer was, financially speaking, more than he could have ever hoped for. The price they had named was above market value, a sum that could secure his retirement and allow him to live the rest of his days in luxury. On paper, it was a deal no rational person would refuse. But for Jackson, it wasn't that simple. As he entered the restaurant, he was greeted by the familiar sights and sounds, the soft lighting, the clinking of glasses, the quiet murmur of conversation. On any other day, these things would have filled him with pride, a sense of accomplishment for the establishment he had built from the ground up. But today, these once comforting details only reminded him of what he stood to lose. Jackson retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. Jackson sank heavily into his leather chair, staring at the framed photos on his office wall. Certificates of achievement, press clippings that praised his restaurant's success. These were the symbols of his life's work, the legacy he had built through years of dedication. And now, everything was slipping away, threatened by a deal he felt pressured into accepting. As he tried to make sense of it all, his thoughts circled back to Malcolm and Lillian Carter. He couldn't shake the memory of that night, the night he had dismissed them, insulted them, and ultimately thrown them out of Maison de Lumière. At the time, he had felt justified, even self-righteous. But now, those actions had returned to haunt him in ways he never could have foreseen. The idea of losing his restaurant to the very people he had looked down on was almost unbearable. It wasn't just about the money, it was about his pride, his identity. For years, Jackson had crafted an image of himself as a man of power and influence, someone who commanded respect and admiration. The thought of selling his restaurant to a couple he had treated with such disdain felt like a betrayal of everything he had built. Yet, the financial offer was undeniably generous, enough to ensure that he and his family would never want for anything again. But as he weighed the decision, he found himself trapped between two powerful forces: his pride and his greed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply his pride was wounded. He had always seen himself as superior to the people he served, above those who worked for him, and certainly above those he deemed outsiders. The thought of those very outsiders profiting from his hard work, controlling the empire he had built, felt intolerable. And yet, what choice did he have? Jackson leaned back, rubbing his temples as he tried to make sense of the situation. The pressure from his investors and business partners was mounting. When he had first hinted at the Carters' offer, they had been thrilled, seeing it as a golden opportunity to cash out. To them, it was just another business deal, a chance to walk away with a substantial profit. If they knew the full story, if they understood the racial undercurrents that made the deal so complicated for Jackson, he knew they would be shocked. His partners had always seen him as a savvy businessman, someone who made decisions based on logic and profit, not prejudice. But Jackson had spent his life carefully curating his public image, hiding his true feelings behind a polished veneer of professionalism. He had never let anyone see the contempt he held for those who didn't fit his narrow view of who belonged in his world. Now, that contempt was costing him everything, stripping away the control he had fought so hard to maintain. The irony wasn't lost on him, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. Just then, Jackson's phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his turbulent thoughts. It was a message from one of his main investors, Richard Foreman. Jackson stared at the message from Richard Foreman, one of the first people to believe in his vision for Maison de Lumière. The message was brief but direct. "We need to talk. Don't let this opportunity slip through our fingers." Jackson knew exactly what Richard wanted. His investors were growing impatient, seeing the Carters' offer as a rare chance to maximize their return on investment. They couldn't understand why Jackson was hesitating, especially when they trusted him to secure a deal that would benefit them all. But if they knew the real reasons for his reservations, Jackson feared they'd start to question his judgment. Despite the pressure, Jackson couldn't bring himself to reveal the whole truth to his investors. Instead, he had kept his responses vague, mentioning the need for careful negotiation and getting the terms just right. But as the days dragged on, his excuses were wearing thin. The pressure was building, and he could feel the walls closing in around him. That night, Jackson sat alone in his office, long after the restaurant had closed. The staff had gone home, the lights were dimmed, and the silence felt almost oppressive. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the window at the city lights shimmering below. The drink burned as it went down, but it did little to ease the turmoil brewing inside him. He knew he needed to make a decision soon. The longer he waited, the harder it would become. Yet this decision wasn't just about money or pride. It was about his identity and his values, or what he had always believed those values to be. Jackson had always seen himself as a man of principle, someone who stood by his beliefs, no matter the cost. But now those beliefs were being tested in a way he'd never anticipated. As he sat there, Jackson began to reflect on his past actions, thinking about the countless times he had judged others, dismissed them, or treated them unfairly, simply because they didn't fit his narrow view of who belonged in his world. He had always justified it to himself as protecting the image of the business, or maintaining standards. But tonight, for the first time, he began to wonder if his reasons had been anything more than hollow excuses. Had his pride really been worth the cost? The question lingered in his mind, refusing to go away. Jackson had long believed that his success was a reflection of his superiority, that his wealth and status proved he was better than those he looked down upon. But as he faced the real possibility of losing everything he had built, he couldn't help but question if he had been wrong. The thought was unsettling, And yet, it held a truth he could no longer ignore. It would have been easier to cling to his old beliefs, to reassure himself that he was right and everyone else was wrong. But deep down, Jackson knew that something had shifted. The events of the past week had forced him to confront aspects of himself he had carefully ignored, and it was a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. The next day, Jackson met with his investors. They gathered in the restaurant's private dining room, a space usually reserved for exclusive clientele. The atmosphere was tense as the investors discussed the offer from the Carters. As the investors shared their thoughts on the Carter offer, Jackson could feel the weight of their expectations pressing in on him. Richard Foreman, always the most vocal, leaned forward, his tone charged with enthusiasm. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for," he said, his eyes bright. "We've spent years building this brand, and now we have a chance to sell it at its peak. We'd be fools not to take it." The other investors nodded, clearly in agreement. Their faces reflected excitement and anticipation. A chance to cash out, move on to new ventures, and secure a profitable exit. They trusted Jackson to lead them, to make the right decision for all of them, but he could feel their patience waning. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Jackson listened to their arguments, nodding along, fully aware of their perspective. Financially, it made perfect sense to accept the offer, but as the conversation continued, he felt a deep unease growing inside him, a sense that this decision went beyond simple profits and losses. For him, it was something profoundly personal, something none of them truly understood. Finally, Richard turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "So what's the holdup, Jackson? You've been unusually quiet. Are you taking the deal or not?" Jackson hesitated, carefully searching for his words. He knew he couldn't stall much longer. The investors' eyes were on him, waiting for the final call. But as he looked around the room, he realized that none of them grasped the real depth of his hesitation. For them, it was simply a business deal, a lucrative opportunity. For Jackson, it was far more complicated. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "I understand your concerns, Richard," he began, keeping his tone as controlled as he could manage. "And believe me, I see the value in this offer. But there are complexities that we need to consider." Richard's brow furrowed, and he tilted his head. "Complexities? What kind of complexities?" Jackson hesitated again, knowing he couldn't reveal the truth, not without exposing the prejudice that had shaped so many of his decisions over the years. Instead, he tried to frame his concerns in practical terms, as if they were simple business obstacles. "The buyers have specific conditions. They want complete control and are insisting I step away entirely." One of the other investors shrugged. "That's normal in a deal like this. New owners typically want a clean slate." "Yes," Jackson replied slowly, choosing his words with care. "But it's more than that. They want me out, entirely out. No involvement, no public statements, nothing. They want me to disappear." Richard frowned. "And what's the problem with that? You've been running this place for years, Jackson. Maybe it's time you stepped back and enjoyed life a bit." Jackson felt a pang of irritation at his words. It was easy for them to say that. They hadn't built this business from scratch. They hadn't poured years of their lives, sacrificed personal moments, and poured their very heart and soul into every inch of this place. But as much as he wanted to argue, he couldn't deny they had a point. He had spent decades working tirelessly, putting the restaurant above all else. Perhaps it was time to let go. But letting go would mean acknowledging defeat, and that was something Jackson wasn't ready to do. The investors continued to press him, pointing out the obvious financial benefits, the security this deal would bring, the freedom he could enjoy if he simply let it all go. But for Jackson, the decision cut much deeper. For Jackson, the decision wasn't just about money. It was about pride, about the legacy he would leave behind. As the investor meeting went on, he could feel their expectations pressing down on him. They trusted him to protect their investments, to secure their futures, but they didn't know the real price he would pay. They had no idea what it would truly cost him to go through with this deal. When the meeting ended, Jackson returned to his office, feeling more conflicted than ever. He knew he had to make a decision soon. Every time he tried to think it through, however, his mind was clouded with doubts and resentment. The financial benefits of selling were impossible to ignore, yet the thought of losing his beloved restaurant, his pride and joy, to Malcolm and Lillian Carter felt unbearable. For days he lived in a constant state of agitation, replaying every detail in his mind, desperately searching for a way out. But no matter how he approached it, he couldn't escape the bitter reality. His own prejudice had led him here. If he had treated Malcolm and Lillian with respect that evening, if he had set aside his biased assumptions, none of this would be happening. But he hadn't, and now he was paying the price. This internal conflict gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night, filling his days with frustration. He couldn't focus on anything else. The weight of the decision loomed over him like a dark cloud, and he knew he couldn't delay much longer. His investors were growing restless, the pressure mounting by the day. Yet, every time he thought about signing the deal, resentment tightened in his chest. Why should he have to give up everything he'd built just because of one mistake? Why should he let Malcolm and Lillian win when, in his mind, they didn't even belong in his world to begin with? But deep down, Jackson knew this line of thinking was wrong. He knew that his pride and prejudice had blinded him for far too long. He had always seen himself as better than others, as someone who deserved his success more than anyone else. Now, as he faced the prospect of losing it all, he was forced to see the truth. His arrogance had been his own undoing. The struggle within him only grew stronger, pulling him in different directions. Part of him wanted to hold on to his pride, to refuse the deal and keep his restaurant no matter the cost. Yet another part of him recognized that this would be a losing battle. The offer was too good, the pressure too overwhelming, and if he refused, he risked losing everything anyway: his reputation, his business, his future. The days passed in a blur, each one bringing him closer to a decision he felt powerless to avoid. Jackson felt as though he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to leap or cling to the edge for as long as he could. He knew he couldn't remain on the edge forever, but the thought of finally letting go filled him with dread. After what felt like an eternity, Jackson finally made up his mind. He would take the deal. He would sell the restaurant, walk away with the money, and try to rebuild his life. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he knew it was his only option. His pride had cost him dearly. He couldn't allow it to take everything. The following week, Jackson met with his lawyers and the Carters' legal team to finalize the paperwork. The process was efficient, almost mechanical, as they reviewed the details and prepared the documents for signing. Jackson sat in silence, barely listening as the lawyers went over each term and clause. When it finally came time to sign, he hesitated for just a moment, his pen hovering over the page, his hand trembling slightly. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the finality of it all. But there was no turning back. He had made his choice, and he would have to live with it. With a deep breath, Jackson signed his name on the dotted line. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving a stark, black mark that felt like it sealed his fate. It was done. The Carters' legal team moved swiftly, ensuring that everything was in order as they finalized the transaction. Jackson felt a strange sense of detachment as he watched them work, as though he were observing the end of someone else's story. Yet, it was his story, and now, it was changing forever. Once the papers were signed, Malcolm and Lillian thanked him politely, their expressions calm and unreadable. There was no gloating, no sign of triumph, only a quiet satisfaction, as though they had simply accomplished what they set out to do. Jackson couldn't help but admire their composure, even if it stung to see them take control of what had once been his. As the meeting concluded, Malcolm extended his hand to Jackson once more. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford. We'll take good care of the restaurant," Malcolm said, his voice steady and professional. Jackson shook his hand, his grip firm but his heart heavy. "I'm sure you will," he replied, forcing a smile that felt hollow. Lillian nodded, adding, "We look forward to continuing the legacy you've built." Jackson simply nodded in return, not trusting himself to say more. He knew they meant well, but the words felt empty. The legacy they spoke of no longer belonged to him. It was theirs now. As he left the meeting, Jackson felt a profound sense of loss. He had made the right decision, the logical decision. But it felt wrong. It felt like defeat, like surrendering to forces he couldn't control. In many ways, it was exactly that. He had been forced to confront the consequences of his own actions, to face the truth of his failures. It was a harsh lesson, one he wasn't sure he would ever fully accept. In the days that followed, Jackson tried to come to terms with his new reality. He told himself the money was worth it, that he had made a smart business decision. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the bitterness remained. He had lost something that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents: his pride, his identity, his very sense of self. For years, Jackson had defined himself by his success, by the power and influence he wielded. But now, he was forced to reckon with the truth. That power had been built on a foundation of arrogance and prejudice, and it had finally crumbled beneath him. He had spent a lifetime looking down on others, and now he was left alone to confront the consequences of a life defined by superiority. The empty feeling that settled in his chest reminded him of what he had sacrificed in his pursuit of control. Believing he was smarter, better, and more deserving than anyone else, Jackson had let his pride shape his life and actions. But now, sitting alone in his empty office, the restaurant no longer his, he realized that the real battle had never been with the Carters, or even with his investors. The true conflict was within himself, with the man he had become and the beliefs he'd clung to so tightly. As he looked toward an uncertain future, Jackson knew the hardest part was still ahead, facing the truth about who he was and who he wanted to be. This was a struggle he'd been avoiding his entire life. The day he signed over his beloved restaurant, Belmontine, to Malcolm and Lillian Carter, would forever mark the end of an era for Jackson, and the beginning of a new chapter for the Carters. The official signatures on those legal documents represented the finality of his loss. As the crown jewel of his career, his pride and joy became theirs. Jackson tried to maintain his composure as he handed over the keys, his fingers lingering just a moment longer before releasing them. Malcolm and Lillian accepted the keys with the same calm professionalism they had displayed throughout the negotiations, thanking him with polite smiles. But this time, Jackson saw those smiles differently. They weren't just courteous, they were triumphant. He could see in their quiet confidence that they had accomplished what they set out to do. As Jackson walked out of the office for the last time, he couldn't shake the sense of finality that weighed him down. The restaurant, once a symbol of his power and success, was no longer his, and the money he'd gained in the sale felt like little compensation. Instead, it felt as though he had signed away a part of himself, a piece of his very identity. In the days following the sale, Belmontine became the talk of the town. The community, long accustomed to the restaurant's exclusive reputation, was shocked by the sudden change in ownership. News of the sale spread quickly, with rumors circulating through the same upscale social circles Jackson had once been a part of. Yet it wasn't only the sale itself that stirred up conversation. It was the story behind it. The tale of Jackson Ashford, a wealthy, proud restaurant owner, subtly disrespecting a successful black couple who came to dine at his establishment, only to end up selling the entire business to them, spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before the details of that fateful night came to light. The cold stares, the veiled insults, and finally the dismissal of Malcolm and Lillian from the restaurant. The community whispered about it in hushed tones, both horrified and captivated by the twist of fate. The story soon took on a life of its own, morphing into a cautionary tale about pride, prejudice, and poetic justice. As it traveled through the city's gossip channels, it became more than just Jackson's story. It became a symbol, a lesson in humility and respect for others. Throughout the community, the story of Jackson Ashford's downfall grew more dramatic with each retelling. Some added details, recounting the incident with a hint of schadenfreude, relishing the fall of a man who had always seen himself as superior. Others expressed genuine outrage, shocked that someone as esteemed as Jackson could harbor such outdated and offensive views. When the local paper published the story, its headline captured the scandal in bold letters: "Restaurant sold to couple once turned away." The article chronicled the events leading to the sale, detailing how Malcolm and Lillian Carter, accomplished entrepreneurs in their own right, had flipped the tables on Jackson. The piece painted an unforgettable picture of poetic justice. a man brought low by his own arrogance and prejudice. For Jackson, the backlash was swift and brutal. Clients who had once admired him for his business acumen began to distance themselves. They had tolerated his quirks and his obsession with maintaining an exclusive image, but with the truth about his behavior now public, they saw him differently. The prejudice he'd kept carefully concealed for years was out in the open, and they could no longer ignore it. Elite patrons who once flocked to Belmontine began to shun him. Invitations to social gatherings ceased, and old friends became too busy to return his calls. Those who had once praised his refined taste and sharp business skills now whispered behind his back, questioning how they had ever associated with him. Even those who privately shared some of his views kept their distance, fearing the taint his reputation might bring. Jackson's downfall wasn't just social, it was financial as well. Although the restaurant sale left him with a sizable sum, it wasn't enough to support the lavish lifestyle to which he'd grown accustomed. His other business ventures began to suffer as word of his behavior spread. Investors pulled out, wary of being linked to someone whose name was now synonymous with disgrace. Opportunities that had once come easily dried up, leaving Jackson with dwindling options. The public reaction was not limited to whispers and cold shoulders. Jackson began receiving letters and emails from people expressing their disappointment, their disgust. Some messages were polite yet firm, others were openly hostile. Former employees who had worked under his demanding gaze began to speak out about the subtle racism they had experienced while working at Belmontine. They recounted stories of being passed over for promotions, treated differently from their white colleagues, and enduring Jackson's condescending remarks. These revelations only added weight to the growing tide of condemnation. As stories of Jackson's discriminatory behavior surfaced, the narrative of his downfall became even more damning. It was clear that the incident with Malcolm and Lillian Carter was not an isolated event, but part of a troubling pattern that had finally caught up with him. Jackson's carefully crafted image was unraveling, piece by piece, and there was no way to salvage the reputation he had once held so dear. As the story of Jackson Ashford's fall continued to ripple through the community, each retelling emphasized his misjudgment and prejudice. The same city that had once celebrated him as a business mogul now saw him for who he truly was, a man whose wealth had cloaked a deep-rooted arrogance. Jackson's feeble attempts to salvage his reputation, claiming the incident was exaggerated or misunderstood, were quickly dismissed. The community had seen his true nature and was not inclined to forgive. Months passed, and Jackson's isolation grew. The social circles he had once dominated were now closed off, and the respect he once commanded had evaporated. He spent most of his days alone, lost in regret and replaying the events that had led to his downfall. He could no longer escape the bitter truth that it was his own choices, his own pride, that had brought him to this point. Once he had seen himself as a man of principle, but now he was forced to confront the reality that his principles had been steeped in prejudice. The impact of the sale rippled through the business world and affected Belle Maison itself. Under the new ownership of Malcolm and Lillian Carter, the restaurant underwent a remarkable transformation. While they preserved the elegance and high standards that had made the restaurant famous, they introduced a fresh, inclusive warmth that had been absent during Jackson's tenure. The clientele became more diverse, reflecting the changing demographics of the city. For the community, Belle Maison's success under new ownership became a testament to progress and a beacon of inclusivity. The restaurant that Jackson had tried so hard to keep exclusive was now thriving under a new ethos, one that welcomed people from all backgrounds. The irony was inescapable. The establishment he had so carefully shaped to reflect his elitist ideals was now flourishing without him, and indeed because it had left him behind. Jackson's life, meanwhile, became a shadow of what it once was. He had retreated to a modest apartment far from the city's upscale districts. Though he still had some wealth from the sale, it provided little comfort. He'd signed away not just a business, but the legacy he had poured his identity into, and the void it left was overwhelming. He had once been defined by his success, his power, and his influence. Now, he was forced to grapple with the truth that these had been built on a foundation of arrogance and prejudice. As stories about his mistreatment of employees and patrons surfaced, Jackson's reputation crumbled further. What had begun as a single scandal now appeared as a consistent pattern of behavior, one he couldn't deny. Under the Carters' ownership, Belle Maison became the ultimate symbol of transformation and resilience. They rebranded it subtly, shedding its former reputation for exclusivity and elitism. The restaurant now radiated warmth and inclusivity, a place where everyone, regardless of race, class, or background, felt genuinely welcomed. Malcolm and Lillian understood that true elegance was not about exclusion, but about creating a space where every guest felt valued. The decor was updated to balance classic charm with modern touches that added character and appeal. The menu also evolved, celebrating an array of global flavors that welcomed diners of every taste. Word of Belle Maison's rebirth spread, and the restaurant quickly became more popular than ever. People from all walks of life came to experience the new dining atmosphere, attracted by its reputation for excellence and commitment to inclusivity. The restaurant became a symbol of positive change, a place that broke down the old barriers of class and race. Business thrived under the Carters' leadership, with revenues soaring and reservations booked weeks in advance. It became a premier destination for anniversaries, business gatherings, and family celebrations, winning high praise from both critics and loyal patrons. Meanwhile, Jackson's story turned into a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when pride and prejudice go unchecked. The community saw in his fall a message of poetic justice, a man who once wielded so much power reduced to a figure of scorn. Alone in his small apartment, surrounded by memories of the life he had lost, Jackson finally understood that he had learned his lesson far too late. The world had evolved, but he had refused to change with it. In the end, he had lost everything that mattered, and there was no one to blame but himself. As Jackson Ashford sat alone in his modest apartment, his former life of wealth and power felt like a distant memory. His bitterness and resentment had been replaced by a hollow regret, a gnawing feeling that he had learned his lesson too late. The world had moved forward, leaving him as a relic of outdated beliefs. Once, he had been a celebrated businessman, but now he was little more than a cautionary tale, a reminder of what unchecked pride and prejudice could bring. Jackson was left with nothing but memories and the knowledge that it was his own actions, not bad luck or misfortune, that had brought him here. He had poured his heart into Bellevue, hoping to create a lasting legacy. But now, the restaurant was no longer his, and the name he had hoped would symbolize prestige and exclusivity was tarnished, forever associated with his downfall. Under the ownership of Malcolm and Lillian Carter, Bellevue underwent a transformation that exceeded the community's expectations. The Carters understood that true elegance wasn't about exclusion, but about creating a space that felt warm and inclusive, welcoming all backgrounds and walks of life. They rebranded Bellevue, carefully shedding its old reputation as a symbol of elitism. The Carters refreshed the decor to blend classic sophistication with contemporary touches, creating a luxurious but inviting ambiance. The menu also evolved, featuring diverse flavors that celebrated various cultures. Every detail of the restaurant, from its layout to its cuisine, was designed to make guests feel valued and appreciated. Malcolm and Lillian's vision redefined what the restaurant stood for, building an atmosphere of dignity, openness, and respect for all. Word of Bellevue's transformation spread quickly through the city. The restaurant began drawing a more diverse clientele than ever before. People from different communities came to experience the new Bellevue, attracted not only by its reputation for quality, but also by its welcoming atmosphere. In place of the social exclusivity that had defined the restaurant under Jackson, it now symbolized a spirit of unity and inclusion. Business at Bellevue flourished, and under the Carters' careful leadership, revenues soared. Critics praised the restaurant's new identity, and guests consistently left glowing reviews. Bellevue became the go-to spot for birthdays, anniversaries, business gatherings, and celebrations. Reservations were often booked weeks in advance, and it quickly earned a reputation as one of the city's most sought-after dining destinations. For Jackson, Bellevue's success under the Carters was a difficult pill to swallow. It was clear that the very thing he had fought to preserve, his restrictive, elitist image of the restaurant, had actually been the biggest obstacle to its growth. With Malcolm and Lillian's open approach, Bellevue had reached new heights that Jackson could only have dreamed of. The irony was undeniable, and it weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, Jackson's own life became a shell of what it had once been. Without his business, without the respect of his community, he was left to face the consequences of his actions alone. The pride he had once taken in his achievements and the power he had once wielded felt empty, reduced to nothing in the wake of his fall. He had spent years building walls around himself, trying to separate himself from others, but now those walls kept him isolated in his own regret. Jackson's wealth from the restaurant sale did little to ease his solitude. The money that had once felt like security now felt hollow, a reminder of the world he had lost. Cut off from his former social circles, he retreated further into his isolation. The people who had once celebrated him now avoided him, uncomfortable with the man they had come to know. The restaurant he had once cherished now represented everything he had lost: his status, his influence, and his self-worth. The success of Bellevue under the Carters became a symbol of progress, proof that change could bring positive results. The community celebrated the restaurant's new spirit, which bridged divides of race and class, creating a shared experience that had once been unthinkable within Bellevue's walls. For many, the restaurant's transformation served as the ultimate irony. A place that had once been exclusive was now thriving precisely because it was inclusive. Jackson, however, was left with only his memories and his regrets. He realized that his refusal to change, his resistance to progress, had led to his downfall. The community saw him not as a pioneer of fine dining, but as a relic of outdated beliefs, someone whose pride had ultimately been his undoing. Now, sitting in his empty apartment, Jackson finally understood that he had let his narrow views rob him of the future he could have had. In the end, Jackson Ashford was left with nothing but the knowledge of what he had lost and the memory of what might have been. He had missed the chance to grow with the world around him, and now he was paying the price. As the days passed, Jackson Ashford became an outsider looking in on the thriving success of Belle Maison under its new owners, Malcolm and Lillian Carter. Belle Maison was not only flourishing, it had become a landmark, celebrated in glowing reviews and hailed as a symbol of transformation. Each article or mention of the restaurant's acclaim felt like a sharp reminder to Jackson of what he had lost. Residing in solitude, Jackson found himself constantly reliving the choices that had led to his downfall, the pride he had clung to, and the deep-seated prejudices that had cost him everything. In his younger days, Jackson had been proud of the high standards he'd established at Belle Maison. He had always framed these standards as necessary to uphold the restaurant's exclusivity and sophistication. But in reflecting on his past actions, he came to see them differently, as an excuse to exclude those he deemed unworthy, a mask for his need to feel superior. Now, the irony of his situation was painfully clear. The very people he had dismissed had proven to be more capable and forward-thinking than he had ever been. Malcolm and Lillian hadn't just preserved Belle Maison's legacy, they had elevated it, creating a restaurant that resonated with the values of a changing world: openness, inclusion, and warmth. Watching from the sidelines, Jackson finally understood what true success looked like. For Malcolm and Lillian, it wasn't about exclusivity or maintaining status. It was about creating a space where everyone felt welcome, a vision he had never grasped. Over time, Jackson's bitterness faded into regret. He recognized how the world had moved forward without him, embracing ideals he had stubbornly resisted. The pride that had once driven him now felt hollow, and the wealth he'd earned from the sale offered little comfort. He was left isolated, disconnected from a community he had once influenced. His years of hard work had led only to a collection of painful memories and a lingering sense of loss. In a moment of weakness, Jackson resolved to return to Belle Maison. He rationalized that enough time had passed. Maybe he could find solace by revisiting the place that had once been his pride and joy. After all, hadn't he built its initial success? Perhaps he could still feel some connection to it. Gathering his courage, Jackson picked up the phone and called the restaurant to make a reservation. The voice on the other end was warm and courteous, confirming Belle Maison's commitment to impeccable service. Jackson introduced himself. "This is Jackson Ashford. I'd like to reserve a table for one this weekend." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by a response that sent a chill through him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford, but we're fully booked for the weekend." The hostess's voice remained steady but distant as she confirmed, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford, but we don't have a reservation under that name." For a moment, Jackson Ashford was stunned. He had expected at least some hint of recognition, some acknowledgement of his years as the restaurant's owner, but her tone was polite, professional, and void of any exception. He was now just another patron, indistinguishable from anyone else on the waiting list. His past ownership, his legacy, didn't matter here anymore. Jackson cleared his throat, trying to compose himself. "Could you check again? I was the previous owner of Belle Maison, you see, and—" "I understand, sir," she replied smoothly, her tone gentle but final. "Our reservations are fully booked at the moment. Perhaps you could try for another date." Jackson thanked her and ended the call, setting the phone down with a shaky sigh. The realization was painfully clear. He had lost not just his business, but his place within it too. Belle Maison had moved on without him, and so had everyone else. The restaurant he once ruled was now flourishing under new hands, hands he had once deemed unworthy, hands that had now turned Belle Maison into a place more inclusive, respected, and successful than ever. Sitting alone in his small, unassuming apartment, Jackson felt the weight of his new reality settle over him. The place he had poured so much of himself into, the establishment that had once been his pride, had no room for him now. Marcus and Lillian Carter had not only taken over his restaurant, they had built it into something greater than he had ever imagined. They had transformed Belle Maison into a space where all were welcome, a space that celebrated diversity and respect in a way he had always resisted. The final irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Jackson had spent years enforcing standards of exclusivity, convinced that this approach made the restaurant successful. He had been certain that maintaining this highbrow image set Belle Maison apart and solidified his legacy. Yet, under Marcus and Lillian's leadership, the restaurant had blossomed with a warmth and acceptance he had never thought possible. They had achieved what he could not, a reputation that extended beyond wealth and status, one that brought people from all walks of life together. For Jackson, there was no escaping the truth. He had crafted his downfall with his own hands, his own beliefs, and his own prejudice. His disdain and pride had closed doors not just for others, but ultimately for himself. The restaurant he had once guarded so carefully was now thriving as a place he could never fit into, a place that symbolized everything he had refused to see. As he sat alone that evening, Jackson felt the full weight of his choices. The regrets, the bitter memories, the loss of purpose, all of it loomed over him like a shadow that wouldn't fade. There would be no going back, no reclaiming his legacy. Marcus and Lillian had risen from the very judgment he had cast upon them, and in doing so had proven to be the true visionaries. They had taken Belle Maison from an exclusive past to a thriving, inclusive present, all while leaving Jackson as a spectator to their success. He was left now with his memories, a shell of his former life, and the haunting realization that he was no longer a part of the world he had once ruled. Do you think Marcus and Lillian's transformation of the restaurant into an inclusive space was the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support helps me continue crafting heartfelt narratives. Thank you for being here on this journey with me.